I'm right here. This is good. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience. We're about to start our next panel for the day on the origins of Yakamein. But as Winston mentioned, this is partly a public history day and partly a memorial for Michael Mizell Nelson, who was a historian and an educator at the University of New Orleans. He was my mentor. I'm Jessica Dotry. This is Kevin McQueenie. And so we were really excited to put this on today with some of our current master's students at UNO in his memory, and hopefully to revive this session. So before we get to the panel, I wanted to invite up Kathy Mizell Nelson to say a few words about Michael.
Thank you, Jessica. Yeah, I managed to dig out my 2009 Poboy Festival shirt. I think it was the first year. But this was an all-consuming project in the fall of every year because Michael would get so excited to have the chance to share the wonderful research that all of his students had been doing. It was always just like the height of his year. So he enjoyed it so much, and when he taught, he always had students do an oral history project of their own choosing with somebody from the community of their own choosing, and they would thoroughly research. They would do, archival primary source research as much as possible too, to further fill out the information that they were getting from the interviewees, and the students would write papers then about what they found and quote from the oral histories. And he would get so excited every semester telling me about, he would come home from work and he'd just be so excited about something that he heard from one of his students, and it was just so cool, and can you believe this? And he was just thrilled by what he would learn from his students. So that was the main thing that I wanted to say. And he would constantly be telling me about Winston and Jessica and Kevin. So I'm really, really happy that you all have resuscitated this program. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we will turn it over to our panelists now. We're trying to revive some of that oral history that Kathy's talking about. So we are collecting memories of Michael and the Carrollton neighborhood. So please stop by on your way out and share a few stories with us. Over to you.
Yeah, and looks like we're not sure where. So we know Linda Green will be joining us. She's been Miss Linda's been having health problems for the past year. She's actually been in and out of the hospital. So we were actually hoping that her eldest daughter Katrina Green would be here, but we actually cannot find the Yakamein stand right now. Hopefully they will appear later today. They are on the map. We weren't looking for them, but yeah, I mean, Linda Green is basically pretty much retired now. I mean, the family has largely taken over the business, the family business, and yeah, basically Katrina Green. I talked to her yesterday because they were at Japan Fest yesterday, and Katrina Green told me that she actually has quit her full-time job with the Orleans Parish School Board. She had been working at one of the schools here. She's quit that job to work full-time managing family business. And I also saw one of the granddaughters yesterday, so a couple of other members of the family are doing that. And the truth is that the rest of the family has been there this whole time. Because the last time I saw Miss Linda in person was 2 years ago here at Poboy Fest, and I met one of the other daughters and some of the other members of the family. So yeah, I mean, they've been that family's been doing this this whole time. So anyway, we're gonna.
I'll run your slides if you want to sit with Liz and let her introduce herself.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Yeah. All right.
We're recording it, so I want to make sure you're in the frame.
Sure. Okay.
So I just want to say hello.
Oh, okay.
I'm not exactly sure what my role is going to be today. My name is Liz Williams, and I'm the founder of the Southern Food and Beverage Museum, and I was going to be the moderator of the panel. But since we have a real expert with us right now, I'm going to turn this back over to Winston.
Yeah, I think you can just because this presentation was meant to be 5 minutes long, so you can just ask questions. Yeah. All right. First slide. So this is basically so what it in fact. There's an interesting story about this. The first time I tried Yakamein was actually at Jazz Fest. I used to work for Jazz Fest. That was in 2007. And I was at the food court, and I saw this thing called Yakamein, and there was a lot of people in line. So being Chinese, of course, I got in line with everybody else. And I tried it, and it was delicious, but it didn't taste very Chinese. And that was my first experience with Yakamein. A couple of years later is when I was in Michael Mizell Nelson's New Orleans history class, and he asked, it's like, have you heard of this thing called Yakamein? And it's like, yeah, but it doesn't look Chinese. And we were talking about what we thought where maybe it came from, and I specifically remember telling Mizell Nelson that I couldn't even think of a methodology of how to go about studying this. But I kept that question in the back of my head all these years. I lived in Asia for a couple of years, and I actually found something that was very similar to Yakamein in Taiwan. But the other thing is that I've been looking at restaurant menus. It turns out that libraries and archives all over the country have collections of menus. Here in New Orleans, between the New Orleans Public Library, Tulane Special Collections, and the Historic New Orleans Collection where I work, we actually have one of the largest collections of historic restaurant menus in the whole country. So yeah, this is actually a menu from the New York Public Library. This is the Oriental Restaurant in New York City, in the New York Chinatown, and you can see that they have something called Yakamein on their menu, and they describe it as a noodle soup with pork. This is the earliest menu that I can find. Next slide. Earliest menu I can find with Yakamein on it. This is a menu from the San Francisco Chinatown. This is actually a famous restaurant, the Shanghai Lo restaurant over there. And as you can see from this menu, they have something called Yak Gourmet at the top of the menu. And by the way, this is going to be a recurring theme. There's no standardized spelling for Yakamein. It's spelled all kinds of different ways. You see that it has a description, noodles with pork and egg. So there's really no question this is our Yakamein. But the other interesting thing is you see that there's a Chinese characters next to it. And this gives us the Chinese word for Yakamein. It's pronounced Yakamein, which is grammatically incorrect in Mandarin. I don't know what it means in Cantonese, which is what this would be. I'm translating it as an order of noodles. So a very generic name, this order of noodles. Next slide. Hopefully the camera's picking this up. I guess I must have skipped this slide. I guess I've deleted some slides to save time. The slide I deleted actually is another menu from San Francisco's Chinatown, and it was a bilingual menu with a English section and a Chinese section. And it's, now that we know what it is in Chinese, it's on the English menu, but it's not in the Chinese section.
Huh.
So, the date of the slide you just saw? I think 1920s to 1930s. Yeah, and this one's from Las Vegas. This is from the UNLV library, University of Nevada at Las Vegas. They didn't give me a date, but you see that they have something called Yakamein, and once again it says with egg and roast pork, and it's listed as a soup, so probably our Yakamein. So it's showing up in the casinos in Las Vegas after the Second World War. I'm also finding it I found it at a restaurant in Minneapolis. So yeah, I mean, we're finding Yakamein all over the country. Next slide. And this is interesting. This is from Virginia, from coastal Virginia. What they call it the Tidewater, Virginia area. And this is the research by the Southern Foodways Alliance over in Mississippi, although some of the Virginia newspapers have also written about this. And they have a couple of restaurants over there that today serve something called Yakamein, or they usually just call it yak. And yeah, it's noodle soup with an egg and some sort of protein. So exactly like our Yakamein. Apparently, it developed independently of our Yakamein. Next slide. So this is the earliest evidence that I have for Yakamein being present for New Orleans. This is a photograph from the New Orleans Chinatown. Yes, New Orleans had a Chinatown. Doesn't exist anymore. Don't worry about it. This is a photograph of a restaurant in the. It changed its name from Ben Hong Lo to Yuhua Jen, but this is a restaurant in Chinatown on Elk Place, and it's from 1918. And I know you can't really see it because it was faded in the original photograph, but there's menus painted next to the door, just like today. They have menus next to their door, and what's on that menu to the right is chop suey and Yakamein, I think. Yeah, Yakamein. Next slide. Yeah, I know. Again, it's next slide. Again, you can't really. Oh, yeah. Anyway. Yeah, so earliest we can find it. This is another menu. This is from the Chinatown Cafe from the 1960s or 70s. You see Yakamein is on that menu. The guy that started this restaurant, it was Ginny Tong and his wife Adra Tong. They had actually been in the restaurant business here in New Orleans since the I think 1944, and Ginny Tong was actually a chef in Houston before this. And aside from the fact that Yakamein is on his menu, the other interesting thing is that Ginny Tong wrote a cookbook. And next slide. Next slide. And you can see that this is the recipe that's in this cookbook. So we have a recipe of Yakamein. You can come by and look at this book later. But yeah, I mean, this is a very simple recipe. And I actually have a number of other cookbooks now. I have much earlier cookbooks, as far back as the 1930s. And Yakamein is in those cookbooks too. Next slide. Yeah. So this is Dan's International, which was a nightclub on Bourbon Street. They actually started out with burlesque shows, but eventually the music became more famous than the women, and especially because Al Hirt and Pete Fountain performed there, so it became famous as Al Hirt's place. But yeah, Dan's International also had a Chinese restaurant attached to it. I think the restaurant was on the left, and then the lounge was on the right. But yeah, I mean, it was basically a nightclub that also served Chinese noodles. Next slide. And this is the menu from Dan's International. And I think we skipped like two slides. What happened? Oh, go back one more. Oh, yeah, this one. Yeah, we've got a couple of selections of Yakamein. One more slide. This is another restaurant in the French Quarter. This is actually on the corner of Conti and Bourbon, behind the old Absinthe House. And the story here, and you see Yakamein is on their menu too. And the story is that the person who owned Jinsmi Hong, and Jinsmi Hong was founded, I think, in 1943 by Alfred Jin. And he didn't have his own liquor license for whatever reason. The rumor is that he was too cheap to buy his own liquor license. But his restaurant was next door to the old Absinthe House, and waiters would take drink orders from customers, and then they'd walk next door to the old Absinthe House and order drinks and deliver them to the restaurant. And presumably old Absinthe House had Chinese noodles too. But between these two and some of the other, Chinese restaurants that were in the French Quarter, I mean, these Chinese restaurants were part of the nightclub culture that existed in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And these restaurants, they gave you a lot of food. They were really cheap. They were open really late. I think Fong's on Decatur was open till 4 in the morning. So this is the theory for how Yakamein gained this reputation as the secret hangover here of the French Quarter. Its nickname was Old Sober in the French Quarter. Next slide. And this is House of Lee. I mean, it's for the longest time, a lot of these Chinese restaurants would have Yakamein, but I think Yakamein was kind of like chop suey. My best guess is that Yakamein is some sort of improvised noodle dish, just like chop suey is probably an improvised stir fry that was invented by Chinese Americans in this country, unknown in China itself, for the most part. But eventually what happens is that when you get to the 70s and 80s, when my people, the Taiwanese and the Hong Kongers, start moving here, and they open these new restaurants, and they have like Sichuan cooking and Yunnan cooking and Peking duck and all these fancy spicy foods. All the old Cantonese style restaurants, the chop suey houses, they came across as bland, and so that's why it's pretty rare to find chop suey on Chinese restaurant menus today, and even more rare to find Yakamein. One more slide. Next slide. And this is China Rose in Metairie. China Rose is I think they opened in the 90s. They're famous for having authentic Chinese noodles. And you see that Yakamein is actually on their menu, and their Yakamein, it has a lot of vegetables in it. It doesn't really taste like Yakamein anywhere else. A lot of the other Chinese restaurants today actually put a lot of vegetables in, because I guess the Chinese really like vegetables. You don't really see a lot of that in our Yakamein. But yeah, I think usually when you go to a Chinese restaurant now, their version of Yakamein is something that the Chinese today have created. Very different from the earlier Chinatown Yakamein, and very different from the Creole Yakamein you usually get in New Orleans. And the other thing is that China Rolls actually has a not-so-secret Chinese language menu, and that's what's on the left. And Yakamein is not on their Chinese menu. They have a lot of noodle dishes, but no Yakamein. Next slide. So, how did Yakamein get creolized? Again, back to Chinatown in the 1910s. Chinatown was located at the 1100 block of Tulane Avenue. So that's down the street from Charity Hospital. It's 1 block from Canal Street. It's actually across the street from what is now the main branch of the New Orleans Public Library. And that is next door to Bacatown, which is a predominantly African-American neighborhood. It's also really close to the main neighborhood. Next slide. And what we have here is back one slide, I think. Back another slide. This is a biographical essay that was written by Louis Armstrong near the end of his life. But it's about what it was like for Louis Armstrong growing up as a kid in New Orleans in the early 1900s and 1910s. And he's talking about how there's these Chinese people in his neighborhood, and they have their own Chinatown. And Louis Armstrong and his mom and his sister used to go to Chinatown all the time and go to the restaurants there. And Louis Armstrong really liked to order red beans and rice from the Chinatown restaurants, because he says that, yeah, it's like they had soul food on the same menu as the Chinese dishes. And the red beans and rice at Chinatown was actually really good and really cheap. And in the bottom of this paragraph, you see that he specifically describes it as a kind of special occasion, as it really was. I mean, this is New Orleans in the 1910s. This is a segregated city in the South, and there weren't actually that many places in the city where an African-American family could sit down and have a meal together as a family. Usually it was just the colored restaurants. Next slide. I think we'll go back 2 slides. I think maybe I deleted it. Yeah, this one. This is actually a newspaper, the Daily Picayune article from, I think, 1911. And it talks about all the businesses in Chinatown, including this paragraph about the restaurants. And this restaurant, which is actually that photograph we saw before, this article specifically says that this restaurant actually was segregated with 2 sections. It had a white section and it had a colored section, but they seated everybody and they served everyone the exact same food. They were probably serving everyone off the same plates. All right, so go back 2 slides. So yeah, I mean, we know that. Yeah, go down 2 slides. So we know. Four slides, I guess. So yeah, we know that African Americans were present at these Chinatown restaurants. So maybe that's how they learned about it. And you see, this is a photograph from 1955, and everyone in the foreground appears to be African American. So presumably this is actually, and this is Walter's place. And you see that Yakamein is, something called Yakamein is on that sign. So this photograph from 1955 is the earliest evidence we have of presumably a black-owned business serving Yakamein to African American consumers. Next slide. And so the rest is this. So yeah, I mean, there's a couple of theories as to exactly how this happened. The easiest explanation is that African Americans saw what Yakamein was and just made it their version of it. African Americans also make their own versions of fried rice and chow mein, and basically, Yakamein doesn't really have its own flavor, so you can basically impose like whatever spices or whatever flavor you want. And so Creole Yakamein, usually it can be very salty, it can be spicy. I was at Chantilly Fest one time, and their Yakamein, it was like drinking like soy sauce. It was so salty, but I guess that's the way the person who made it liked it. Yeah, Linda Green's Yakamein is way better. It's also very bold and flavorful, but much more balanced. But so that's the easiest. And I asked, if you remember her, June Lee from Golden Dragon. I asked her like, why don't you have Yakamein in your restaurant? And Miss June was like, anyone who can boil water can make Yakamein, so that's why she didn't make it. So that's the easiest explanation. They just copied it and they modified it. But there is another more intriguing possibility, and it's interesting because Liz Williams interviewed both myself and Linda Green, and we both said the same thing, that there was, like I said, Chinatown was next door to Bacatown. African Americans, African Americans and Chinese were both in the laundry business. They were doing a lot of service jobs. There was a lot of interaction between black men and African American women, and we know about several mixed families, Afro-Chinese families. So maybe we're in a situation where we have African American women who learned how to make Yakamein so they can serve something that their husbands would eat, or maybe we have some of these Chinese husbands who knew how to make Yakamein from working in the restaurant business and made Yakamein for their families and adjusted those tastes for their spouses and for their children. So maybe Yakamein is some sort of product of that interaction between those two cultures. We may never really know. Maybe it's a combination of those things. But anyway, yeah. This is our question phase has now started.
So why is it that you think that Yakamein is found in African American communities all over the country, not just here?
Well, I mean, it's cheap, it's filling. I think those are the two best explanations. And basically, it's an example of one of these things that, another example of this is like funerals with music, the so-called jazz funerals or second line funerals. Back in the 1800s, everybody had funeral processions with music. The Italians would do it. There's evidence that the Chinese, when they had funeral processions here in New Orleans, that they processed down Canal Street and to one of the St. Louis cemeteries or something, and they had a band. So everybody was doing this. But for whatever reason, that tradition that was originally universal died out with every community except the African American community. So African Americans have basically preserved this culture and adapted it to their own music and to their own dancing, while it died out with everyone else. So maybe that's what happened to Yakamein. Yakamein basically died out everywhere else except in the black community.
So what brought the Chinese people?
Okay, this is a long story, but the short version is that I'm finding Chinese very early in history because I also do cemetery research, and I found a tomb in St. Louis Cemetery number 2, written in Chinese and French. It's the top of the closure tablet has broken off, so the name is missing. But we know from city death records that his name was John Lengui, and he was a native of Macau. So there's no question that he was that he was a Chinese immigrant. And that tomb has been there since 1848. That's what it says in Chinese and French, that it's been there since 1848. And that tomb was built a couple of months after gold was discovered in California. So this is like that tomb is, so he was here before the California gold rush. So very early in history. We're also finding, it was actually Ryan Gray's research. If you're Ryan Gray, the archaeologist from UNO, he wrote his master's thesis about this Chinatown laundry here in New Orleans, Chinese laundry here in New Orleans. And so he was looking at the census schedules for 1850 and 1860s, and there's like 24 Chinese people in the 1850 and 1860 census. So Chinese are here very early, not a lot of them, but all of the early Chinese in the census schedules, almost all of them are listed as either stewards or cooks. So these are guys that were working aboard ocean-going steamships, and presumably they were doing the same job on these Mississippi River steamboats that were going up and down the river. We're also finding Chinese tombs in like Kentucky in the 1850s. So yeah, it's like that was probably the earliest group were these sailors, but there weren't that many of them. We don't even know if they were permanent residents or if they were just sort of passing through. The ship just happened to be docked here. The first major wave of Chinese migration was actually during Reconstruction, and what happened is that slavery was abolished, so the planters had to start paying the people who worked for them, and these planters were like, hey, the Chinese will work cheap, so they brought in tens of thousands of Chinese people, not just to Louisiana plantations, but plantations in Mississippi, Arkansas, Texas, Alabama, I think South Carolina. So this is some of the first Chinese in those states. It turns out that the Chinese didn't like being treated like slaves any more than African Americans did. So all the Chinese were gone, almost all of them were gone by the 1870s. Although interestingly, a handful of Chinese actually remained on the plantations, turned into sharecroppers, and married other sharecroppers, the daughters of other sharecroppers who were African American sharecroppers. So more of these mixed Afro-Asian families, we're finding them in the census schedules too. Yeah, it's like, but most of the plantation workers ended up leaving Louisiana, but they were the plantation workers were very quickly followed by Chinese merchants. So they came in the 1870s as well, and it's the Chinese merchants who founded the New Orleans Chinatown in the 1880s, and the Chinese have been in New Orleans ever since. Yeah, that wasn't really that short.
So, do you think that there's any other reason other than people just living together, in neighborhoods and things, that there was cross-pollination? Do you think it had anything to do with, African American soldiers during the war, or anything like that?
No. Because I've heard these other theories of these other conflicts, and you see it's on them. It's just this, yeah. I mean, we're finding evidence that they're already in Chinatown before the First World War. So no, I don't think all these other theories, I don't think it's possible.
I just wanted to make sure that you had a chance to say that. Okay, so I think that it's really interesting to see what kind of cross-pollination that there is in various neighborhoods because of people living so close together. I think you also saw that with a lot of the Sicilians who came out of the French Quarter and lived in Tremé because the French Quarter was full, and you see all these Sicilian names in the jazz bands and things like that. So I don't think that it's a stretch to believe that there's lots and lots of interaction.
Yeah. How much do you know about Matasas? Like they had Do you want to talk about, because they were also at a partition, right? The bar.
Yes. Well, I think rather than just talk about Matasas in particular, the same reason after the Emancipation Proclamation was passed, the Sicilians came to New Orleans because they were actually recruited by a Louisiana Department of Labor office in Palermo. And they came as indentured servants and worked on the sugar plantations because in Sicily there were already people who were working on sugar plantations or sugar farms in Sicily. So you had already skilled labor because it takes such skilled labor to make sugar. And I basically think the whole thing wound up being just then that once the people from Sicily walked away, they said, let's bring in Chinese people, and they just kept looking for, I don't know, acquiescing people. It's hard to know what they were thinking, that people were going to be just like, oh, I love being practically enslaved.
Yeah, and this is also how I think the first Italians ended up in Mississippi. They were also contract workers on the plantations over there. But no, it's like as I understand, yeah, Matasas. Matasas is famous for their grocery, but there used to be a bar behind the grocery, and as I understand it, that bar was also partitioned between a white and colored section, and their partition went through the middle of the room, and it wasn't right to the bar, and the partition wasn't that high, so people in each section, in the white and colored section, socialized with each other in the bar, over the partition. So yeah, so I think the Italians were another group that also were heavily discriminated against, just like the Chinese, and didn't really take segregation seriously.
Does anybody in the audience have any questions? Yes.
Do you know anything about opium dens in Chinatown?
All right, the question is, do you know anything about opium dens in the Chinatown?
No. So, this is a very long conversation because I think the whole opium thing, I've been calling it the Hop Alley myth, and it's kind of like it's kind of like the lost cause narrative, I think. because I've been looking for evidence of opium in Chinatown, and basically opium, you could buy opium in Chinatown. The jazz musicians tell us that you could do it, but here's the thing, you could buy opium in any pharmacy in the country. The pharmacy museum in the French Quarter, they tell you that they sell opium, except it's not called opium, it's called laudanum. But laudanum's primary active ingredient is opium. And it's like a lot of the patent medicines also had opium in it. On top of that, heroin was widely available. Heroin had been issued to Civil War soldiers who were wounded, and a lot of Civil War soldiers suffered grievous injuries. So there was this whole generation of war veterans that were actually addicted to heroin. And so that's when the German pharmaceutical company Bayer they were heroin. There was a morphine. They gave out morphine, and Bayer pharmaceutical company in Germany invented heroin as a more concentrated version of the active ingredient in morphine, because they thought that heroin would be less addictive than morphine, and there were advertisements in all the newspapers telling people, yeah, it's like you can eliminate your addiction to morphine by taking shots of heroin, and the Sears catalog had heroin that they would mail to you through the mail, and with a syringe. So yeah, the addiction wasn't really understood in the 1800s. For most of the history that Chinatown existed, it wasn't until the 1920s, really because of prohibition. Because of prohibition, that's when the federal government developed this idea of controlled substances. So it's in the Anti-Narcotics Act, I think in 1921. That's when all forms of opium is banned, all forms of marijuana is banned, cocaine is banned, all those drugs are banned. And the people that are arrested under that law are actually physicians at first, because they've been prescribing heroin and morphine to treat the illness of withdrawal. So in other words, like the whole narrative, and it wasn't illegal. Like selling opium was not originally illegal. There were maybe local ordinances that banned opium dens, but it wasn't a federal law. So it wasn't until the 1920s, and Chinatown was destroyed in 1937. So for most of the history of Chinatown, opium was actually illegal. So really, and I'm finding opium dens in the newspapers, but they're not in Chinatown. In fact, they seem to be in every neighborhood in New Orleans except Chinatown. And Chinatown was across the street from Storyville. So there were opium dens in Storyville. So the evidence is that, there's no evidence of opium dens in Chinatown. What's going on here is that there's this narrative of Chinatowns as being a nest of opium dens and prostitution and tongs of criminal gangs. And that seems to be a narrative that was invented because of all the anti-Chinese racism, and because they wanted to put an end. So they didn't want Chinese immigrants coming to this country. So that whole narrative exists at the same time as the Anti-Chinese Exclusion Act, as the anti-Chinese laws. And in fact, the evidence that I'm finding is that the Chinese actually are basically trying to keep criminal organizations out of Chinatown. In fact, they actually had a welcoming committee to the Chinese Presbyterian Mission. Their job was to welcome new Chinese who came to the city, but their other job was to vet people to make sure that they had no ties to organized crime. There's a newspaper article that describes the Chinese community basically asking the NOPD to arrest this guy that just showed up in town because he's just trouble. And the Chinese people got the police to kick this Chinese guy out of the city. I also encountered another guy. He's from Will Smith, I think, I'm probably mispronouncing his name. He's from the University of Idaho, and he's a descendant of one of the foremen on the Transcontinental Railroad. But then he became an opium smuggler here in New Orleans. And the evidence is that he had no contact with the Chinese community here, because the Chinese community here will probably rat him out to the police. Instead, he was in Storyville. And he ended up marrying one of the prostitutes there, or light-skinned woman of color, a Creole of color. And they had several children together. They were never officially married. Then they had some sort of falling out, and this woman of color, this light-skinned woman of color, she and her children moved to San Francisco, and she passed for white for the rest of her life. And eventually their African American ancestry was forgotten. And so this professor he's one of their descendants, and he's been looking in this history. And it turns out that there's actually another professor over in San Francisco who's working on a book because apparently a lot of other light-skinned people of color had also gone to San Francisco and passed for white for the rest of their life, and so there's a book project in the works about that. Yeah, I'm sorry, my answers are all long. This happens when you talk to historians.
Ladies used to have these beautiful crystal vessels that had laudanum in it, and I mean, you could just get it, and if you had the vapors or whatever else women were supposed to have, you could get laudanum and treat yourself. So, and remember also that Coca-Cola had actual cocaine in it as part of its original recipe, and it actually had to be reinvented after cocaine became illegal. So, you know, that was why it was a pick-me-up.
Yeah, the caffeine and the cocaine, and the coca leaves that where cocaine comes from. Coca leaves are still used in the Coca-Cola recipe today. That's why Pepsi doesn't taste anything like Coca-Cola. I don't think they have. They just have the caffeine. I don't think they have the coca leaves. But the coca leaves, all the active ingredients of cocaine have been removed, and they use that to make some sort of like painkiller. But yeah, and the other thing is that so opium has sedative qualities in addition to pain-killing qualities, and so mothers would actually give like a little spoonful of laudanum to their babies to help them sleep, and then they would take the laudanum themselves to help calm down, I guess. So yeah, so it was an over-the-counter drug.
I can tell you a personal experience. So I was born in 1950, and so it was still that you could still buy things like Paragard, which had opium or opiates in it. And my father gave it to me as a baby, and he was told he was supposed to give me 5, it was on a piece of paper, 5 drops in my bottle, but apparently they had put they had forgotten to put 5.0, and it just said 5.0, and he gave me 50 drops. And apparently I slept for 4 days.
Oh my gosh.
So.
Wow.
Do you have any more questions? Yeah.
Can you share with us how Linda Green got started with selling Yakima?
She had been working as a cook in one of the schools in the Orleans Parish school system when Hurricane Katrina happened. So she was laid off of her job. And I think the story, do you know the story? I think the story that she tells is that she still had kids that were in college, so she needed the money. So yeah, she took her mom's, which is also, it had gone through the family through at least 2 generations. Her grandmother also had, I don't know how far back in time that recipe goes. But yeah, she started serving her family's Yakamein recipe at festivals, and including Jazz Fest, and it just started getting more and more popular, and she became famous as the promoter of this Yakamein dish, which people always knew about in her neighborhood, but it's like wasn't that well known apparently in the rest of the city. So, you know.
And it got revived at Jazz Fest. Yeah, it became introduced to the rest of the city.
Like I said, it's like literally there were all these people in line. I don't know how many of you have been to Jazz Fest, but when I worked at, it also happened with music. I remember one time Carolina Chocolate Drops, which is an African-American bluegrass band. They combined like soul and R&B and even hip-hop with bluegrass. And part of it was a long tradition of African-American bluegrass musicians that's kind of forgotten now. I mean, the banjo is basically derived from a West African instrument. But no, it's like nobody had heard of Carolina Chocolate Drops in, I think, 2008 when I worked at Jazz Fest. And they were on stage. And all of a sudden they rushed into the tent at Borders where I was working, and we're like, we've never heard of this band. We're selling them their records, and we sold out. And luckily, the Carolina Chocolate Drops actually showed up later that day and sold us another box of CDs. But yeah, that sort of thing happens a lot at Jazz Fest. You have a question?
You mentioned the destruction of Chinatown in the 30s. I was just wondering if you could tell us like the why and the how.
So I don't have a map of Chinatown with me, but so the question is, what happened to Chinatown? It's how was it destroyed in 1937? Well, I don't have a map with me, but Chinatown, there's this one building. They actually call it Chinatown Row, and it went across the entire length of the 1100 block of Tulane. And there were all these, like, it looked like most of the Chinese businesses were in that one large commercial property. And it was the Depression, and the person who owned that building apparently wasn't making enough money collecting leases from the Chinese, so he tore down the building and turned it into a parking lot. And I do have a photograph of the parking lot, and when that building was destroyed, that basically cut the heart out of Chinatown, and all the Chinese businesses moved right after that. But what happened is that many of these Chinatown businesses ended up moving to the French Quarter, to Bourbon Street, of all places. And these Chinatown businesses lingered on Bourbon Street until the 1980s. Jinsby Hong that you saw, they closed I think in 1987, and they were probably the last Chinatown restaurant to close. So yeah, any more questions?
Thank you to all of you. It was really fun talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Yes, thank you.
Before you all go, let me just preview what's ahead. So at 1 o'clock, we're going to be showing Streetcar Stories. This is a documentary about the history of streetcars in New Orleans, produced by Michael Meiselmaus. And the director of the film, Matt Martinez, will be here showing the film and also taking questions about that. So that's coming up at 1 o'clock. Until then, we're going to be collecting oral histories. So if you have food histories about food in your family or your community that you would like to share with us, if you have memories of Michael that you'd like to share with us, if you have histories or memories about the Carrollton neighborhood, we are also collecting those. So we've got some sticky boards for the Carrollton map. We also have a station over there to collect oral histories. We're going to be recording them as audio. So if you'd like to share those with us, we would be happy to take them. If you don't want to share them today, but would like to share them at some point, we can also get your contact information and contact you in the future. And we would love to collect those oral histories. But thank you all for coming. Thank you for the panelists. This was a really fascinating presentation. And we will be back at 1 o'clock with Streetcar Stories.